Why did Tony Stark never create a suit out of vibranium? And is this one of the biggest missed opportunities in the MCU? Over the course of Tony's life, he created almost 90 distinct suits of iconic Iron Man armor, each with their own purpose and functionality. But across all of these suits, we don't see any evidence that Tony ever used vibranium, one of the rarest and most durable metals on the planet, that being of course that belongs to the Black Panther and the people of Wakanda. So why is this, and why did Tony Stark never make a suit out of vibranium? The earliest days of the MCU are by far the easiest to explain, as vibranium didn't become a major component of the MCU until Age of Ultron, and until that point, the only major vibranium object was Captain America's shield, which was believed to be one of a kind since it was the only example of a vibranium tool or weapon that any of the Avengers had or the wider world knew about. When Age of Ultron was released though, it was revealed that Tony knew that Wakanda had deposits of vibranium, and that more importantly, Ultron had taken a supply of it for himself. He used massive amounts of it to create not just the reactors that launched Sokovia, but also built himself a brand new body lined with vibranium plating. Between the wreckage of Sokovia and the remains of Ultron's primary body, surely Tony would have been able to come up with enough to at least augment his own suit with vibranium if he ever wanted to. On paper it makes perfect sense, as Tony is looking to continually upgrade his suit with new tools and gadgets, so vibranium should, in theory, be a perfect fit. But there are a few challenges with vibranium. Since the MCU never gives us an outright explanation for this though, we'll have to theorize about a few different reasons from the comics and other lore. First, we know that once vibranium is molded, it is incredibly difficult to reshape after it's been refined from its ore. Thor, Tony, and Vision were able to damage Ultron's body, but only with their combined efforts, which included the power of a literal Infinity Stone. So one option is even if they did recover Ultron's body, he simply didn't have the capacity to reshape the metal without a forge capable of getting hotter than anything currently known to man, and Iron Man could not reshape the vibranium metal. When Ultron stole the vibranium deposits, it's important to remember that he stole the ore, which could still be crafted into whatever shape he wanted it. This is also what makes Captain America's shield so iconic, since it was unable to be broken until Thanos finally had enough brute force to get the job done with his sword. The durability of vibranium is insane. The idea only works under two conditions though, the first of which is that Tony wasn't smart enough to figure out a way to reshape vibranium, but given everything we know about Tony Stark, this is highly unlikely. This is the same person who replicated the power of the Tesseract by creating a new element in Iron Man 2, and the same man that figured out how to navigate time travel in just a few days, along with so many other feats. The idea that Tony couldn't find a solution is a bit far-fetched, so let's look into the other condition, which is that he was able to recover Ultron's body in the first place. It's entirely likely that Ultron's body in the wreckage of the engines was either lost when Sokovia was destroyed, or that it didn't fall under Tony's jurisdiction. One possibility is that whatever remained of Sokovia, or perhaps the United Nations or Wakanda, reclaimed the vibranium since we never formally learned what happened to Ultron's body, and it may have returned to Tony after all. If this is true, then this would simply become a matter of rarity. We know that Vision's body is described as being worth $3 billion, but this is only after Wakanda opened its borders to the world and allowed more free trade of vibranium and vibranium-related products. Until then, it was hard to pinpoint exactly how much vibranium was worth, but we know based on the laws of supply and demand that it would have been worth much more before Wakanda became a major distributor. Black market vibranium could have gone for much higher rates, which means that even by Tony's standards, enough to make a suit would have been insanely expensive, his most expensive by far. Let's take a minute to look at the basic math before we move on to the next option. The default weight of Vision is said to be around 300 pounds, which would put the price of vibranium in 2024 at $10 million per pound, assuming that all of Vision's components were made of vibranium, and this is after the price was lowered significantly after Wakanda's involvement. Pre-2018, this number would have been astronomically higher though. Most of Tony's suits weigh well over 100 pounds, or $1 billion per suit if they were made completely out of vibranium. We also know that Tony can create functional suits that weigh much less than his own, like the suitcase armor from Iron Man 2, which could be carried relatively easily and transported extremely easily. Tony's net worth is estimated to be around $12 billion, but Stark Industries is estimated to be worth around $80 billion, so the price of vibranium shouldn't really be a factor for Tony. So if it's not price, we'll have to look at a different aspect. What about another viable reason for Tony not choosing to use it? If Tony had shown some interest in vibranium, why didn't he speak to T'Challa about it, especially when they were allies during the events of Civil War? But even with the combined efforts of Tony and Cap, it's unlikely that T'Challa would have ever relented and said yes to allowing Tony to use vibranium deposits. Remember, T'Challa was an isolationist before the events of his own film, where we saw what happened to Killmonger, and this ultimately changed his views for the end of that movie and the future of Wakanda. When he and Tony knew each other, he was still very reluctant to let any vibranium leave the borders of Wakanda, especially if it meant putting it into the hands of the once notorious arms dealer. Tony Stark made his fortune by developing weapons of mass destruction, and even though he was well on his way to redemption, we believe that this was not a cause that T'Challa would have supported. Furthermore, it's important to remember that he had actively begun harboring Steve and Bucky, putting him at great odds with Tony if he ever were to find out. So even if Tony had asked, T'Challa would have never obliged him, likely why Tony never asked. But let's take it further and talk about what would have happened after T'Challa opened the borders of Wakanda and created an outreach center. If Wakanda was more willing to share their science and technology with the world, then could Tony perhaps get his hands on some vibranium now? Black Panther is said to take place roughly a week after the events of Civil War, and therefore, about 2 years before Infinity War, which would have meant that Tony would have had plenty of time to explore vibranium as a viable suit option. It's important to remember, though, exactly where these two characters were in terms of their own respective journeys. The Avengers had all been but completely ripped apart, so Tony was more invested in that than ever, creating a perfect suit of armor that could defend the Earth when the Avengers could not. But Tony was no longer focused on durability, but rather versatility. The point of the Mark 50 nanotech suit was that it wasn't his strongest armor, but it was his most capable by far. It could do so much more than any of the previous models. Everything that Tony had been working to build had been essentially perfected with the Mark 50. Tony added proper flight stabilizers, automatic repairs, melee weapons, and an array of gadgets that could manifest from nanotechnology. Making a suit out of vibranium would have made for a much stronger, more durable suit of armor, but it would not have had the same amount of sheer versatility that the Mark 50 had, which is where Tony put his focus. T'Challa's second Black Panther suit does operate very similarly to the Mark 50, in that it can materialize around the wearer at a moment's notice, but this came with a significant drawback of vibranium. Creating a flexible vibranium mesh like this made the suit susceptible to supersonic interference, which could compromise the integrity of the Black Panther suits, which is exactly what we see in the final moments of the first Black Panther movie. This is how T'Challa is finally able to beat Killmonger, and it would have created a huge weak point in the Mark 50 armor if Tony ever used it, or any other vibranium armor for that matter, at least one similar to the Black Panther armors. So this means that if Tony wanted to create a suit of vibranium armor, he would need to create something much more rigid, something with plates like his previous suits that then lacked flexibility. When we look back at the complete evolution of Tony Stark's suits, we see that they are all sleeker and sleeker, but they also come with the drawback of being less durable over time. His Mark III armor was an absolute beast in terms of durability, but it didn't have the same flight maneuverability or agility as the later suits did, so we know that Tony is prioritizing movement over strength, at least at first. Obviously, the later suits are more durable, but Tony found it more advantageous to be more sleek rather than wear a straight-up juggernaut suit of armor. Tony has never relied solely on brute force. He's far more obsessed with the versatility of his suits. Creating a flexible suit of vibranium would have come with a gaping flaw, which also explains why he didn't reach out after Infinity War, but more on that in just a minute. Even if he had wanted to, T'Challa's outreach was more philanthropic than anything else. He wanted to help communities with social outreach, not to distribute more weapons to people who could use them to wreak havoc on the world. So while he may have been happy to give Tony some of his most helpful technology, raw vibranium still seems like it would have been off the table. When T'Challa blipped, however, Tony's lifeline to Wakanda was severed, and he didn't know anyone else that he could ask within the Wakandan royal family during the events of the blip. But we know that this was not his biggest problem. In Black Panther, Killmonger had burned the Garden of the Heart-Shaped Herb. This meant that during the blip, Wakanda did not have a Black Panther, so they had much bigger problems to worry about. The ramifications of the blip were just too severe for Wakanda to even consider selling vibranium to Tony, so he elected to upgrade his nanotech suit instead. He created hollow shields so that he didn't have to use nanites to protect himself, and then lose those particles when they got destroyed. He devoted more time to his family, and effectively retired from the Iron Man role. even though we know that he created more than 30 additional suits in these 5 years. Right now, the biggest factor that seems to have inhibited Tony from creating a Vibranium suit was his limited access to Vibranium in the early years, and when he did have a better chance of getting his hands on Vibranium, he had already pivoted focus to a project that Vibranium would not have serviced very well at all. But anyway, my friends, what do you think of this explanation from an MCU standpoint? Do you think that this is why Tony never made a suit of Vibranium armor? And do you ultimately think that this was a mistake? Or was this wise on behalf of Iron Man? Was it a good decision not to make a suit entirely out of Vibranium? As always, my friends, if you found this video insightful or interesting, it would help us out a great deal if you could smash that subscribe button, and I hope you're having a great day.